He had always considered himself a patient man, someone who found solace in the steady rhythm of his suburban life. The house he owned sat in a quiet neighborhood, flanked by neatly trimmed hedges and wide sidewalks that rarely saw more than a few cars at a time. Routine comforted him, morning coffee on the porch, afternoon chores in the garage, and a light jog at dusk. He lived in peaceful harmony with the hum of distant traffic and the soft chatter of neighbors passing by. In this unremarkable yet reassuring environment, he never expected to encounter a problem so bizarre it would transform his daily ritual into a surreal battle of wills. But everything changed the day Karen parked a semi-truck across his driveway. He first noticed the massive vehicle early one morning when he opened his curtains to let in the sunrise. Instead of the usual serene view of the street and the modest row of houses, he was greeted by the hulking form of a commercial truck stretched across his driveway, blocking the entire exit. Its cab shone in the fresh daylight, a jarring presence on a suburban road too narrow for such a monstrosity. The glare of the sun on the chrome grille only heightened his disbelief. At first, he assumed it had to be a mistake. Perhaps a delivery gone wrong or a driver stopping for a quick bathroom break. Yet, no one was in the cab. No one was outside directing traffic. It simply sat there, occupying his property as if it belonged. Curiosity turned into annoyance as he threw on a jacket, walked out his front door, and approached the semi. He circled it, eyes drawn to the bold pink lettering and decorative decals that could only belong to one specific person, Karen. She was infamous among the neighborhood for her theatrical displays, though nobody quite understood why she owned a semi-truck in the first place. Some said she inherited it from a distant relative, others joked she had purchased it just to prove she could. Regardless of the origin, here it was, blocking him in, making it impossible to move his own car from the garage. He felt his pulse quicken. He had things to do, errands to run, appointments to keep. Yet there was this monstrous machine cutting him off from his day as if his schedule was insignificant. Trying not to lose his temper, he went to Karen's door, pressing her doorbell with more force than he intended. She answered in a bright, flowery blouse, hair perfectly coiffed, eyeing him with an exaggerated look of confusion. He explained the situation calmly, pointing at the truck and detailing how it blocked his only exit. She offered a saccharine smile and insisted she would move it soon, claiming she had a series of urgent errands that demanded her immediate attention. He tried reasoning with her, the truck was obviously on his driveway, she had no right to leave it there. Her excuses, however, were baffling. She told him she needed just a few hours, maybe less, maybe more, and that she really thought he could be more flexible. As she closed the door, she uttered a final, dismissive comment, "Don't be so uptight. It's not like you're going anywhere important." He stared at her front porch in stunned silence. This violation of his property and the nonchalant attitude that accompanied it were surreal. He remembered the rumors about her intransigent behavior, how she once demanded a neighbor remove their mailbox because she claimed it didn't match the neighborhood's aesthetic, or how she wrote petty complaint letters to the HOA about children's bicycles left on lawns. Still, seeing her disregard for his driveway was something else entirely. For the first time in years, anger began to simmer at the back of his mind, but he swallowed it down. He hoped she might come to her senses once she realized how unreasonable her actions were. Unfortunately, she was just getting started. The hours dragged on, and the semi remained resolutely in place. By mid-afternoon, he had tried knocking again. This time, Karen didn't open her door. Whether she was gone or simply ignoring him, he couldn't tell. Unable to move his car and stuck at home, he made calls to the local authorities, thinking they would help. Yet the situation turned comically bureaucratic. He was informed that unless the truck was parked illegally on the public street, or creating a hazard in the roadway, it was considered a private property dispute. The police suggested he address it through civil channels or talk to the HOA. Infuriatingly, they offered little immediate relief. Determined not to escalate things prematurely, he sought out the HOA, only to discover that Karen had friends in high places among the board members. When he explained the predicament, he was met with patronizing smiles and vague promises to look into it. After half an hour of politely stating his case and receiving no meaningful assistance, he returned home, seething at how Karen twisted even the simplest problem into a complicated mess. Days like this made him question whether his attempts at civility mattered in a neighborhood that seemed all too willing to look the other way when Karen was involved. By the next morning, the situation had only become more ridiculous. He woke to the roar of the semi's engine, rushing outside with a glimmer of hope that Karen was finally moving the behemoth away. Instead, he found her tinkering under the hood, claiming some mechanical issue was preventing her from driving it off his property. On top of that, she had placed orange cones around the perimeter of the truck, as if it were a construction zone, further solidifying her bizarre claim to a space that was not hers. She spoke to him briefly, complaining about the inconvenience the breakdown was causing her and scolding him for not being more sympathetic. Before he could get in a word of protest, she had hopped into the cab and slammed the door shut, refusing to engage any further. He suspected there was no real mechanical issue, just an excuse to prolong her hold over his driveway. Although he pressed her for a more definitive timeline, she offered only vague assurances that a mechanic would come when they had time. Tension started building in his gut, each slight adding to the mounting frustration. Trapped again for another day, he had to reschedule meetings and beg for rides from friends, each phone call laced with embarrassment and anger. Karen's stonewalling methods and the HOA's indifference infuriated him, but he still yearned for a diplomatic resolution. That evening, he gathered a few neighbors he trusted, people who had also borne the brunt of Karen's antics in the past, and laid out the entire story. They nodded sympathetically, sharing their own exasperating tales of her intrusions. But they all echoed the same sentiment: she won't stop unless someone makes her. The idea of making her gave him pause. He didn't want to stoop to any unethical retaliation. He valued fairness and the law. But with each retelling of Karen's outrages, the seeds of a plan started to form in his mind, a plan that would use her arrogance against her in a way she wouldn't see coming. The days stretched on, and the tension thickened like summer humidity. Karen's semi-truck remained immovable, and she occasionally emerged to bark more excuses about parts or scheduling conflicts. The HOA's emails gave him no comfort, only politely acknowledging they'd heard concerns. His frustration reached boiling point when he realized that Karen was hosting casual gatherings in her backyard, with the monstrous truck still commandeering his driveway. It was as if she had no sense of guilt at all, relishing the disruption she caused. Over mugs of coffee and hushed conversation, the neighbors urged him to file a civil suit or call a tow company. But tow companies hesitated. Such a large vehicle needed specialized equipment, and nobody wanted to risk the legal blowback if Karen complained. It was in that moment of powerless fury that he decided, if the conventional methods wouldn't help, he'd turn to a more cunning approach. He spent the next few days carefully researching property laws, local codes, and any little clause he could use to his advantage. He pored over thick documents late into the night, discovering interesting rules about commercial vehicle storage, easements, and city permits. A glimmer of satisfaction danced across his eyes when he found just the right legal thread to pull. Karen might have friends on the HOA, but she couldn't override municipal regulations that governed commercial vehicles. Specifically, the city code declared that semi-trucks could not remain parked on residential property for more than a limited time without a permit. She also needed appropriate signage and safety measures, especially if the vehicle obstructed a driveway in any way. The fines were substantial. He compiled his findings, printing out and highlighting relevant passages. At the same time, he began to speak quietly to neighbors who had also felt Karen's wrath. While many felt hesitant to go toe-to-toe with her, they rallied around the idea of witnessing wrongdoing being lawfully addressed. Some offered testimony, photos, or any detail that might strengthen the case against her. They were tired of her petty manipulations. By orchestrating these small acts of unity, he started building a solid foundation for retaliation. This would be no reckless revenge but a meticulously legal blow that Karen couldn't dismiss as mere whining. He bided his time, letting Karen continue to sink deeper into her own hubris. Whenever she repeated that the truck issue was none of his concern, or that these things take time, he took careful notes, documented every conversation, and stored them in a neat folder. Every instance she refused to move the truck, every day that passed, and every minor argument she initiated were building blocks in his dossier. With each piece of evidence, he felt the sense of rising empowerment that comes with recognizing a lawful advantage. Finally, after witnessing Karen hold an impromptu dinner party with the semi still blocking his driveway, forcing him to catch another ride just to buy groceries, he decided it was time. The humiliation of not being able to use his own car in front of guests was the final push he needed. The city might have been slow, the HOA might have been partial, but there was no escaping the might of zoning regulations and neighborhood codes, especially when a dedicated homeowner was willing to use them to full effect. Under the cover of late evening, he walked around the block, placing official-looking notices on the telephone poles near Karen's property. The notices cited sections of the municipal code about commercial vehicle violations, suggesting that the occupant could face stiff penalties if she didn't comply. He mailed copies of these regulations to Karen and CC'd city officials, highlighting in bright red ink the fines and enforcement procedures. Meanwhile, he discreetly emailed a council member with whom he had once volunteered at a local charity event, explaining the outrageous situation in detail. He knew that if they caught wind of a blatant violation, they'd be compelled to act or face questions about ignoring the city's own rules. Days passed, and Karen appeared unfazed, initially. She breezed in and out of her house, throwing passive-aggressive remarks over the fence about how some people needed to chill out and accept that life happens. Yet behind that veneer, she was squirming. He noticed her checking the mail more anxiously, making frantic phone calls from her porch, and glancing warily at the pile of official documents he continued to send. Still, she didn't move the truck. Maybe she thought she could bluff her way out of it. Perhaps she assumed her HOA connections would save her. Whatever her reasoning, it played perfectly into his hands. The longer that Semi stayed, the stronger his case became. Then came the official city notice taped to her door. He watched from inside his living room as a uniformed city inspector hammered it in place, ignoring Karen's sputtering protests. He couldn't hear their exchange, but he saw her outraged body language, watched her rip the paper down, skim it, and wave her arms in disbelief. His phone buzzed soon after, neighbors confirmed that they too had seen the notice, and rumor spread quickly that Karen was in serious trouble. She tried to shame him publicly, claiming in a group email that he was harassing her, but her accusations fell flat. Nearly everyone in the neighborhood had lived under her critical eye, her relentless tattling, and her sense of entitlement. They knew better. By the following week, the city threatened daily fines if the semi-truck was not removed. The sum climbed higher by the day. Still, Karen stalled, presumably hoping to conjure a mechanical excuse or find a scapegoat. It was a foolish move that only added to her looming financial burden. The tension in the air was palpable, he could sense she was on the verge of a meltdown. Each morning, he'd step onto his porch with a cup of coffee, glance at the truck, and wonder if this would finally be the day she caved. He almost felt a twinge of pity, but then he remembered all the chaos she inflicted on him and his neighbors. The well of sympathy dried up quickly. It happened rather suddenly. The city enforcement officer returned one afternoon, clipboard in hand, followed by a tow operator who specialized in large vehicles. Karen erupted from her front door, screaming about property rights, mechanical malfunctions, and potential lawsuits. She was dressed in a robe and slippers, an odd costume for such high drama, but it only underscored her disarray. Neighbors peered out from windows and behind fences, some filming the altercation on their phones. The tension had escalated into a spectacle, shouts, threats, and the roar of a heavy-duty tow truck. The officer remained calm, pointing out that Karen had been warned multiple times and given ample opportunity to comply. The truck was still illegally blocking someone else's driveway, and the city had received multiple complaints from residents who, in sworn statements, testified to how long it had been there. Karen's face twisted in rage and panic when she realized that all the cunning smiles and dismissive laughs had led to this single moment. Her precious semi was about to be hauled away, and she was about to be saddled with monstrous fines. He watched the drama unfold from a short distance, arms crossed, heartbeat steady. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing justice operate in broad daylight. Karen hurled insults at him, spouting that he was a vindictive neighbor and a liar. But the city officer waved her off. The facts were too blatant to ignore. Each day the truck had blocked his driveway, each day she refused to do anything about it, all documented. And once the city threatened daily fines, Karen had no excuse. No mechanical problem could justify ignoring an official order for that long. The tow operator began hooking up the front of the semi, working methodically despite Karen's shrill protests. The sight of her beloved truck, forcibly hitched to a massive rig, drew gasps and hushed excitement from onlookers. She pleaded, switching tactics from aggression to desperation, offering to move it herself if they just gave her a few more hours. The city officer shook his head, calmly explaining that the time for voluntary compliance had passed. Indeed, it had. With a deafening rumble, the rig pulled away, towing Karen's prized possession down the street to an impound lot. A hush fell over the neighborhood as she stood there, stunned, robe flapping in the wind. In the aftermath, the fallout for Karen was severe. The city imposed heavy fines for her violation of commercial vehicle parking regulations. The impound fees for retrieving the truck soared by the day. The higher they went, the more trapped she became, forced to pay enormous sums just to get her property back. Neighbors whispered that she might be dipping into savings or even taking out a loan to cover costs. Worse yet, the semi's removal shattered her carefully cultivated image of someone who could do as she pleased without consequence. Soon the HOA board, perhaps sensing that Karen had become a liability, distanced themselves from her. She had lost face not only in the eyes of city officials but also among the very people she once bossed around. Her usual channels of petty influence dried up. She could no longer bully neighbors with the same smug confidence. Rumor spread that she even tried to rally friends on the board to lessen her financial burden, only to be told there was nothing they could do. Seeing how quickly her allies abandoned her, she realized she was left to fend for herself. Naturally, she tried to blame him for everything: the fines, the towing, the mockery from neighbors. But her tantrums fell flat. Even those who sympathized with the discomfort of losing a vehicle recognized she had brought this on herself. The truck had absolutely no business blocking a private driveway for weeks on end, no matter how many excuses she spun. Silence settled where her criticisms once echoed. She was the one who had ended up in a corner, financially strapped, publicly shamed, and stripped of the power she once flaunted. It was a complete inversion of her typical posture as the neighborhood queen. He should have felt victorious, but he mostly felt a calm sense of resolution. He had not resorted to vandalism or illegal activity. Instead, he used her own arrogance, her disregard for codes and laws, to expose her. A quiet sense of satisfaction washed over him every time he left his garage without obstruction. Sure, it had taken weeks of frustration, but the sweet taste of relief made the ordeal worthwhile. More than anything, he was glad the neighborhood recognized her for what she was, a menace fueled by entitlement. Karen's life began to spiral in the wake of the impound. She faced mounting costs and repeated phone calls from towing companies and city offices. Whenever she did show her face around the neighborhood, she wore an air of forced nonchalance. But the cracks were evident. She no longer swaggered down the sidewalk. She avoided eye contact. Sometimes she snapped at neighbors who merely commented on the weather, as though any small talk threatened to unmask her humiliation. Word emerged that Karen was negotiating with potential buyers for the semi-truck, presumably trying to cut her losses rather than pay the rising impound and parking fines. The humiliating fiasco became gossip fodder: how Karen had bragged about having the money to handle any fine, only to scramble now in a desperate attempt to unload her liability. The neighbors who had once tiptoed around her defiant presence were suddenly emboldened, occasionally letting slip a chuckle when she passed by. She'd scowl and stomp away, jaw set in anger. For him, each day felt freer, the weight of the blocked driveway gone. He no longer dreaded stepping out of his house. Though he remained watchful, Karen was unpredictable. He sensed she'd never regain her old bravado. She had gambled and lost. The city's laws had teeth, and those who witnessed her downfall would remember the spectacle. Even the HOA, for all its flaws, began adopting stricter guidelines regarding the storage of large vehicles on residential property, specifically citing Karen's case as a cautionary example. It was, in many respects, a public relations nightmare for her and a public victory for the residents who had grown tired of her stunts. He spent a peaceful weekend at home, savoring the normalcy of running errands on his own schedule, parking in his own driveway without complication. The stress that had once knotted his shoulders melted away. He realized, in quiet reflection, that Karen's bullying might have continued indefinitely if not for her own overreach. By blocking him so egregiously, for so long, she gave him the perfect scenario to seek legal recourse. She had orchestrated her own downfall, and he had simply shown her the door. The house was calm, his life was back to normal, and the storm she created had finally dissipated. When the final blow landed, it was fittingly dramatic. Karen, cornered by the city's enforcement letters and the impound lot's mounting costs, faced a last-ditch effort to rescue her situation. She tried to file a complaint against the city, claiming they had no right to tow her vehicle from private property. But the hearing with the municipal board ended swiftly when they presented pages of evidence proving she had violated multiple ordinances, not least of which was blocking another resident's driveway without permission. The entire fiasco was laid bare: timestamps, photos, eyewitness accounts. Her complaint was dismissed, and she was ordered to pay all outstanding fees plus any administrative costs incurred from her frivolous claim. In the end, Karen was forced to sell the semi-truck for much less than its market value. The buyer, a skeptical individual who had read about her story online, negotiated her down to a sum that barely covered a fraction of what she owed. The transaction took place in hurried whispers by the curb, and a neighbor who witnessed it described the look of utter defeat on Karen's face. Once her prized possession, the truck now symbolized her financial ruin and public embarrassment. Her downfall didn't stop at money. In a matter of weeks, her social ties in the neighborhood eroded almost entirely. A few close acquaintances stuck around out of pity or habit, but the general consensus among residents was that Karen had shown her true colors. Even her attempts at hosting friendly gatherings fizzled, with many neighbors mysteriously busy whenever she invited them. Without that aura of intimidation, she was just another neighbor, albeit one who had orchestrated the biggest parking violation meltdown the street had ever witnessed. He observed all this from a distance, neither gloating publicly nor offering her a hand. She had made her bed. Occasionally, he saw her scurrying out to her car, wearing large sunglasses, as though trying to avoid anyone's gaze. He recalled the satisfaction of pulling his own car out of the driveway for the first time after the truck was gone, the sense of victory and normalcy blended into one. Karen's fate was sealed by her own obstinacy, and he felt a calm acceptance that justice had been served. Whatever rage he'd harbored had evaporated, replaced by a confident peace that came from standing up for himself. In the aftermath, life in the neighborhood returned to a more pleasant rhythm. Without Karen's constant theatrics, small disputes remained small, seldom escalating into community-wide chaos. People felt freer to chat across fences, invite each other over for barbecues, and park on their own property without fear of inciting her wrath. The neighborhood seemed to collectively exhale, relieved that the days of endless complaints, meddling, and arrogance were gone. He resumed his daily routine, breakfast at dawn, quiet moments reading on the porch, evening strolls under the dim glow of streetlights. Every now and then, the memory of the semi-truck fiasco brought a wry smile to his face. It was a story he could hardly have imagined, let alone believed, before living through it. Yet it had happened, and the experience left him with a sobering realization: even the calmest of individuals could be pushed to fight if provoked by unbridled entitlement. Karen's presence in the community faded further when a moving van arrived in front of her house several weeks later. Rumors circulated that she was moving to another neighborhood, perhaps seeking fresh ground to cultivate her illusions of superiority. The day the moving truck pulled away, she offered no goodbyes, no fanfare. The air felt lighter. Neighbors joked that she'd probably wreak havoc wherever she landed next, but at least it wouldn't be here. The sense of closure was nearly tangible. For him, the sense of satisfaction was twofold. He had defended his rights and proved that even the most arrogant neighbor could be taken down legally and decisively. He had worried, at times, about sinking to her level, acting out of spite. But in the end, he realized he had used proper channels to ensure fairness and safety in his own driveway. It was Karen's disregard for boundaries that had sealed her fate. Watching the last vestiges of her occupancy fade in the distance, he allowed himself a final grin. No more obstructed driveway. No more stress and humiliation. She was gone, and he was free. Soon after Karen's departure, the neighborhood erupted in quiet celebration. The HOA board, now somewhat chastened, began to revise its policies for handling resident disputes, ensuring that no single individual could manipulate the system so thoroughly again. Residents welcomed these changes, seeing them as a step toward a more harmonious community. The revised guidelines clarified the rules for large vehicles and underscored the penalties for blocking driveways, referencing the fiasco as a pivotal example. It became a piece of local lore, a cautionary tale about arrogance and how it could unravel when confronted with solid legal recourse. He received a few appreciative gestures from neighbors. Some baked cookies, others stopped him to say thanks for standing up to Karen and shining a light on her bullying tactics. Despite feeling slightly awkward in the spotlight, he appreciated their gratitude. He took these moments to emphasize that the entire neighborhood's support had contributed to the resolution. It wasn't one man's victory, it was a community's stand against inappropriate behavior that had gone unchallenged for too long. Late one evening, as he relaxed in a comfortable chair on his front porch, he reflected on the sequence of events. It was a comedic tragedy from one angle, an infuriating standoff from another, but ultimately a satisfying resolution. The memory of Karen's semi blocking his driveway no longer sparked anger, it had transformed into a mild amusement, a bizarre footnote in his suburban life. He replayed the final image of her helplessly watching the tow truck haul away her prized possession, a perfect metaphor for the downfall of someone who believed they could trample over others' rights without consequence. With the porch light flickering softly, he thought about how quiet the street was now. A car rolled by, headlights scanning the pavement. No more anxious glances at a monstrous rig overshadowing his front door. The feeling of peace was almost uncanny. He savored the moment. After all, it wasn't just about reclaiming his driveway. It was about reclaiming his sense of security in the place he called home, a place that was supposed to be tranquil and accommodating, not ruled by the whims of a neighbor who refused to respect basic decency. Yes, life felt better, more stable. Karen's reign had ended, and he felt nothing but relief. Weeks bled into months, and the neighborhood settled into a serene routine that felt like a welcome return to normal. Conversations about Karen became less frequent, fading into the backdrop of everyday life. People went about their business, mowing lawns, decorating for holidays, hosting garage sales, without the overbearing presence that once loomed. Some even joked about writing a comedy skit inspired by the fiasco. The infamous day a semi-truck blocked an entire driveway had turned into a local legend, complete with exaggerated retellings and humorous embellishments at neighborhood cookouts. He sometimes caught himself wondering whether Karen had learned anything from the ordeal. Perhaps she managed to rebuild elsewhere, adopting more humility. Or maybe she simply found another community to torment. Either way, it was no longer his problem. His presence in that driveway was once again undisputed, and the simple pleasure of backing his car out without obstruction became a daily reminder that justice, when pursued cleverly and persistently, could triumph. The anxious pit in his stomach was gone. The knot that had tied itself in his chest had loosened. Peace had been restored. Looking back on the entire experience, he realized how it challenged his limits. He had been mild-mannered, assuming the best in people, and yet forced to confront someone who flouted every social norm. The clash had ignited a spark of defiance in him, a refusal to be trampled upon. In some way, it awakened a part of him that recognized the importance of boundaries and the necessity of standing up for them. This realization lingered with him, shaping his interactions even after Karen's departure. He found himself less inclined to yield to small injustices, whether a rude store clerk or an unfair policy at work. Subtly, he had grown. As time wore on, the remnants of Karen's bizarre escapade became little more than a set of anecdotes shared by neighbors on lazy afternoons. Each retelling carried a sense of relief and a pinch of glee. They all had endured her meddling for too long, and it felt good to see that her tactics weren't invincible. He remained the quiet hero, the man who stood firm and provided the push that led to her downfall. No applause or trophy greeted him, but the contentment in knowing he upheld his property rights and dignity was more than enough. Karen's old house was eventually sold. The new owners were a friendly couple with 2 dogs, eager to fit in and keep to themselves. In stark contrast to Karen's flamboyance, they quickly blended into the neighborhood's rhythm. He waved to them from his porch one morning and smiled to himself, remembering all that had happened. Life had a strange way of correcting imbalances. In the end, the trouble Karen caused had only strengthened the ties among neighbors who chose unity over divisiveness. And so, under the pale blue sky of a once turbulent street, he settled back into a life untroubled by semis or the demands of a tyrannical neighbor. The driveway lay wide open, a small but vital symbol of freedom. He quietly celebrated his victory every time he stepped onto that asphalt, turning the key in his car's ignition, unimpeded by the monster silhouette that once loomed large. Karen had been conquered by her own hubris, leaving him with a sense of closure that was both gratifying and serene. The house felt like home again. The war was over, and he had won.